Right, let us come to the 10-minute rule motion. Or statement. What is it? Right, let's come to the statement on housing, communities and local government. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government accepts that the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry must be the catalyst for long-lasting, systemic change. All members of the House, past and present, will have shared my anger over its shocking findings. The inquiry chair, Sir Martin Morbick, and his dedicated team uncovered damning evidence of political, corporate and individual failings going back decades. These led to the loss of 72 innocent lives. 18 of them were children. On that terrible night in June 2017. Madam Deputy Speaker, it was a deadly betrayal, a national tragedy, but that must never happen again. I will repeat today what the Prime Minister said in September. To bereave families, the survivors, and those in the immediate Grenfell community, and some of whom are with us today in the gallery, on behalf of the government, the British state, and those responsible, I am very sorry. The inquiry report made 58 recommendations, of which 37 were directed at the government. The government accepts the findings of the report and will take forward all the recommendations. Our response, published today, addresses each in turn and goes further to set out our wider reforms of social housing and on the construction sector. As we make these vital changes, we will publish quarterly reports on the progress and update Parliament annually. The government is open to scrutiny and will remain accountable for its actions. We will prioritise residents and protect their interests and make sure that industry builds safe homes and provide clearer accountability and enforcement. To have anyone, anywhere, living in an unsafe home is one person too many. That will be our guiding principle and must be that of anyone who wants to build or care for our homes. That will be an important part of the legacy of Grenfell. Madam Deputy Speaker, for nearly 8 years, despite their pain, the bereaved, survivors and members of the community have campaigned with determination, not wanting anyone to suffer as they have. And it is fair to say that the building system that we have today is not the same as the one that was justly criticised in the report, the one we had leading up to the tragic events of 2017. But it is also clear that there is still much more to do. So I can announce that we will create a single construction regulator and a chief construction advisor, and will set out our detailed plans later this year. And I am accepting the recommendations to professionalise fire engineers and assessors, to licence principal contractors and to review the role of building control. Where standards are clear and industry has clarity and certainty on how individuals and firms must behave, it encourages investor confidence. And this will improve the safety of residents, support the construction industry and our mission to deliver economic growth. We have pledged to build 1.5 million homes over the Parliament to tackle our country's acute housing crisis, part of our plan for change to improve the lives of people across the country. And it is vital that these future homes, as well as existing homes, are safe and of a high quality. And I welcome how some parts of the industry have stepped up to lead the necessary change in culture and approach. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, lest we forget, Sir Martin found that just about every institution and organisation charged with keeping the tower safe and protecting those who called it home failed. His most devastating conclusion was that every single death was avoidable. The inquiry uncovered serial incompetence and negligence, complacency and inaction, and blatant dishonesty and greed. The organisations that failed included the government and regulators. The department that I now lead, which failed to act on known risks and ignored, delayed or disregarded matters affecting the safety of life. And the manufacturing companies, including Arcanic, Kingspan and Celotex, whose products were used to refurbish the tower, the report found that they acted with systemic dishonesty and they missold and they marketed them. Their disgraceful mercenary behaviour put profit before people and exploited the regulatory regime to evade accountability with fatal consequences. And to my disgust and their shame, some have shown little remorse and have refused to even help fix the building safety crisis that they did so much to create. Companies must be held to account for their role in Grenfell. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Cabinet Office is announcing today that she will use new powers under the Procurement Act to investigate Arconic, Kingspan, Saint-Aubin as owners of Celotex at the time and other organisations. And I expect swift, decisive action and will ensure progress is reported. But we must do more to make sure that the right rules are in place. To this day, critical gaps persist in how construction products are regulated. Only with rigorous reform will we transform the culture that allowed the tragedy to happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, to achieve this, we are also publishing today a construction products reform green paper. It will help us to cut out the rot in the sector and allow competence to take root. Safety will come first and a culture of responsibility will prevail. We will celebrate those that lead the way and those that fall short will suffer the consequences. In the future, road companies will be held to account. Our green paper sets out our ideas for how prison time for executives who break the rules and unlimited fines where safety is put at risk. We will do whatever it takes. Across the sector, we know that there is appetite for change. That change is overdue, and we will lead it. I've paid tribute to the enduring resilience and resolve of the bereaved families and the survivors and members of the immediate community. Their campaigning has seen new legislation passed, which members of this government also supported, that has made our public realm more secure. Everyone is safer thanks to the Building Safety Act, which set new standards for construction of residential buildings in England. It introduced the Building Safety Regulator and provisions for high-risk buildings. All people living in flats now know that the entrance doors, external walls and structure of their homes are in scope of fire risk assessments, thanks to the Fire Safety Act. There are new duties for owners and managers of buildings and blocks of flats. The Social Housing Act ensures that landlords are held to account. I have challenged the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea to demonstrate how they have changed by becoming an exemplar landlord and local authority. And I'll be keeping a close eye on their progress. And we will listen to their tenants to assess whether they have succeeded. We are pushing ahead with the remediation acceleration plan to fix all buildings around the country still with dangerous cladding, and where building owners fall short, we will act. We are introducing regulations to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable residents in high-rise and higher-risk residential buildings. And as of the 1st of April, ministerial responsibilities for fire functions will move from the Home Office to my department, in line with the inquiry's recommendation that we bring responsibility for fire safety into a single government department. Madam Deputy Speaker, people and their safety are front and centre of our inquiry response. But there remains a stark and terrible reality. The bereaved and the survivors and members of the Grenfell community are still waiting for the justice they need and deserve. And justice must be done. Madam Deputy Speaker, the ongoing Metropolitan Police investigation is amongst the biggest it has ever undertaken, and the Met has the government's full support. In September, the Prime Minister rightly said that this tragedy posed questions about what social justice means in Britain today, whether the voices of working-class people, those with disabilities, those of colour are ignored and dismissed. I am here to say that we will not be that country. We will be a country where decent housing, where security, where safety, where peace of mind are shared by all and not just the privilege of a few. The lessons of this inquiry should not have taken a tragedy to unearth. We will honour the memory of those who lost their lives by bringing about meaningful change in their name, change that will make life better for everyone. We are under no illusions about the scale of the task at hand. The responsibility to deliver lasting change is the privilege of leadership. This will not be done by government alone, but we will put our voice and our power in the service and the cause that the Grenfell community has continued to fight for nearly 8 long years. We will together bring about the transformational change that people of this country deserve. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it is with that admiration for their spirit and the determination to honour it that I commend this statement to the House.
I call the Shadow Minister, Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for advance sight of her statements and the Government's response to the Phase 2 report. Can I begin by echoing the sentiments of the Deputy Prime Minister shared across this House? The tragedy of Grenfell, which claimed 72 innocent lives, 54 adults and 18 children, will always remain a scar on our national conscience. Can I thank Sir Martin Moore-Bick and his team for their work? And can I join with the Deputy Prime Minister in offering my deepest apologies to the bereaved, the survivors and the Grenfell community for the failures that led to that horrific night in June 2017, a night where we all remember where we were. Can I also thank them for their constant and constructive campaigning? The inquiry's findings, decades of systemic failure, dishonesty and negligence, are a damning indictment of successive governments, regulators and industry. The Government's response, with its acceptance of all 58 recommendations, is a step forward, and I welcome the commitment to action. The creation of a single construction regulator, the appointment of a chief construction advisor, and the consolidation of fire safety functions under one department are long overdue reforms. So too is the focus on professionalising fire engineers and reforming the construction product sector, a sector the inquiry exposed as riddled with systemic dishonesty from firms like Iconic, Kingspan and Celotex. The Green Paper on construction products reform is a promising start, but it must deliver real accountability. Unlimited fines and prison sentences for rogue executives and, where appropriate, government officials cannot remain mere rhetoric. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, ambition must be matched by urgency and scrutiny. Nearly 8 years have passed since Grenfell, yet thousands still live in buildings with unsafe cladding and other fire safety defects. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, although I welcome the fact she's accepted the majority of these recommendations, can I ask her why she has not accepted the inquiry's recommendation for the single regulator to oversee testing and certification of construction products, leaving this instead with conformity assessment bodies. Can I remind her that the Building Research Establishment, itself a conformity assessment body, was strongly criticised for having its own conflicts of interest. The remediation acceleration plan is welcome, but its targets, assessing all buildings by July 2025 and completing works by 2027, rely heavily on developers stepping up voluntarily. What actions will she take if they do not comply? Will she work to deliver solutions for non-qualifying leaseholders and those at risk as a consequence of other fire safety defects? This House needs concrete assurances that no resident will be left behind. I question the phased approach to implementation, stretching beyond 2028. Justice delayed is justice denied, and the Grenfell community has waited long enough for change. Why must they potentially wait another parliamentary term for full delivery? What discussions has the Leader of House had with parliamentary colleagues on the establishment of Public Inquiry's Joint Committee to monitor the implementation of Public Inquiry recommendations? What is the timetable for new publicly available record on all inquiry recommendations since 2024? On social housing, the extension of AWAB's law and new standards are positive, but the government must go further to address the inquiry's wider lessons. Residents' voices were ignored. Tenant empowerment must be more than a panel or a campaign. It needs legal teeth to ensure landlords act on concerns swiftly. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, justice demands accountability. The Metropolitan Police investigation has our full support, but the pace must quicken. Those who profited from cutting corners or who were criminally negligent must face consequences, not just fines, but criminal charges where evidence allows. Grenfell must be a watershed, a legacy of safety, transparency and respect for every resident. Can I make clear our commitment to work with her and her government on a cross-party basis to meet that promise?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for his comments and the way in which he made them, and I hope genuinely that we can work together to continue this piece of work. I recognised in my opening statement the work of the previous government with the Building Safety Act and other measures, and we will continue to work in that vein. I hope the Honourable Member recognises some of the work we're already doing. We've brought forward a significant amount of legislation around social tenancy, around empowering tenants in the Renters' Rights Bill, around leasehold, how we can protect leaseholders, and our remediation acceleration plan. The Government will deliver these legislative changes as soon as parliamentary time allows, and the legislation commitments are detailed in the plan, and that will include creating certainty for buildings that need remediating and who is responsible for remediating them, make obligations for assessing and completing regulation remediation clearer with severe consequences for non-compliance, and give residents greater control in situations of acute harm where landlords have neglected their responsibilities. The Shadow Secretary of State asked me about single construction regulator. We did accept that in principle, but the single regulator will deliver the functions recommended by the inquiry with two exceptions to avoid conflicts of interest by both setting the rules for construction products and policing its own compliance. But we will consult on the design of the regulator in the autumn.
Yeah. I call the Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to start by recognising that today is yet another long, exhausting day for the loved ones of the victims of Grenfell, who are still having to fight for justice nearly 8 years on. I welcome the Secretary of State's response, and I look forward to the Select Committee scrutinising the proposals for the single construction regulator and the Green Paper. But if we're honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Secretary of State has outlined won't tackle the root cause of the systematic ignorance of concerns of tenants, that toxic stigma which is at the heart of our social housing sector. Can the Secretary of State outline what steps she's taken to make sure that tenants have a voice in the social housing sector and the respect when they raise concerns for their families? Madam Deputy Speaker, we must never forget that 41% of the victims of Grenfell were disabled, a figure which underlines the collective failure of the system to protect those in need. The government's commitment to residential evacuation plans for disabled people in high-rise buildings is a welcome step forward, but I'd be grateful for some clarity from the Secretary of State on how the government intends to make residential PEEPs enforceable if the responsible person fails to identify the vulnerable resident. I'm also pleased that funding has been allocated for this in the social sector, but the reality is disabled people live in all types of housing. So can she give a commitment in her response that disabled people in the private rented sector will have the same access for an evacuation plan to those in the social sector? I'll close, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that none of the families in the gallery should be here today. This tragedy happened in the holy month of Ramadan in 2017. As Ramadan approaches this week, a time that should be dedicated to reflection, to healing, togetherness, too many families are still fighting for justice. No family member present today should have to spend their time demanding accountability when they should be focused on recovering on that trauma. I pay tribute to their tireless effort and pledge to continue to be a voice for them in their fight for justice without any more delay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as Chair of the Housing, Community and Local Committee, I know my honourable friend's commitment to the rights of social housing tenants. The social housing system, as she outlines, has not been fit for purpose, and these failings contributed to the Grenfell tragedy. We're driving up standards in social housing through stronger regulation and enforcement measures, strengthening tenants' voice and improving access to redress. These reforms will ensure landlords are held accountable for the quality of homes and services that they provide. And at the heart of the new regulatory regime is the requirement that all landlords treat tenants with fairness and respect. Social landlords are required to understand and provide information and support that recognises the diverse needs of their tenants, including those arising from protected characteristics and language barriers. And the government will lay regulations as soon as possible this year on social housing provider funding made available this year for residential PEEPs. We will direct the regulator to set standards on competency and conduct of staff to ensure that tenants are treated with respect. At the national level, we have extended the Social Housing Residents Panel, which will help ensure that tenants' voices and experiences inform policy development. We will keep a new regulatory system under review. We will evaluate its effectiveness by 2028 to ensure it's delivering the improvements we needed. And also, we will set out further measures to strengthen residents' voices in the long-term housing strategy later this year.
I call the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Liberal Democrats stand firmly with the many bereaved and their family members, as well as the immediate community, friends, neighbours, as they mourn the 72, including children who tragically lost their lives in 2017. Any steps regarding the changes to the building will be a deeply personal matter for that community, Madam Deputy Speaker. And any decisions regarding the future of the building, I know the Secretary of State will approach with due respect for the local community, survivors and victims. We welcome, therefore, the Government's decision to work with the Grenfell Memorial Commission to design a memorial and urge the Government to approach the discussions, as I'm sure she will, the Secretary of State will, with respect and sympathy to those who suffered. Liberal Democrats are also concerned that as we approach 8 years on from Grenfell, there are still thousands of people in the UK living in buildings with dangerous cladding. The Grenfell inquiry provided a detailed look at the facts leading up to the night of the 14th of June 2017, including underlying causes of the fire, where mistakes were made, the condition of the tower, the response to the public and emergency services. And with regard to the recommendations to the architectural profession, I refer the House to my register of interest as a member of the Royal Institute. There are lessons, though, to be learned for every authority in the land. We recognise the previous government provided funding to start this process, which is now slowly being allocated to deal with cladding, but now it's time to accelerate that vital work to make all buildings safe. We're concerned that too many developers and building owners are passing the costs of remediation work onto tenants and leaseholders, which puts many at serious financial risk. Liberal Democrats endorse all 57 recommendations of the Grenfell Phase 2 report from Sir Martin Morbick, which includes pointing to creating a legally enforceable order to remediate premises so they are safe on pain of criminal sanction. But we need to take further steps to guard against commercial interests overriding safety, as they did both in the testing of materials and in the enforcement of building regulations. And we would like to see more done to ensure that commerciality will not shockingly and disgracefully once again override interests of safety. It is time to invest in our housing stock so that the cladding is dealt with. It is time for justice for the victims and all those living in unsafe housing. Lib Dems stand ready to work across party to do so.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for his commitment and his support in taking forward the recommendations that came from the inquiry, and also can I also thank him for his comments in regards to ensuring that we take decisions about the future of Grenfell in the most sensitive of ways, and I absolutely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and I'm committed to taking the next steps respectfully and carefully with the community. I'm also continue to support the independent Grenfell Tower Memorial Commission as the community choose a design team to work with them on designing a memorial. Can I also agree with him that the priority is that we have to work at pace as quick as we possibly can, Madam Deputy Speaker, because this work is urgent and we're working as quickly as possible. Some of the inquiry recommendations are wide-reaching and some will require further work, including public consultation before they can be delivered. But where we can work quickly, like the machinery of government change, moving fire to my department as an example, we're committed to do that as well. Hopefully the Honourable Gentleman has heard my words on the acceleration of remediation, our action plan there, and also I agree entirely with his comments, and hopefully that was respected in my response earlier around commerciality not taking precedent or having any control over safety. Safety must come first, and this government is committed to that.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement today and the Prime Minister for his statement on September 4th that made clear that the lessons from Grenfell are central to this government's mission. Today is another painful step towards truth, justice and change for the bereaved families of the 72 people who lost their lives at Grenfell, the survivors and the community in my constituency of Kensington and Bayswater, many of which who have joined us here today, and I pay tribute again to their strength and resilience. The fight for justice, now nearly 8 years long, will continue after today and every day until we have criminal prosecutions and true accountability for those responsible, including those companies referenced in the inquiry report. I know the government has looked seriously at the inquiry recommendations, and I welcome the commitment to meaningful change across all of them. But it does remain the case that recommendations from public inquiries too often fail to be implemented. Yes. Indeed, if the lessons from previous fires had been learned, including Lakanal House in 2009, then lives would have been saved. This was avoidable. Yes. So can the Deputy Prime Minister assure me that the government will consider a strong mechanism of oversight to ensure accountability for implementing what has been set out today, so it lasts beyond any one government and leads to real change? And will she also provide further detail on how she plans to ensure accountability for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, given their culpability before, during and after the fire, and the desperately needed change in their culture and the improvement in the quality of services today in our community?
Can I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to the way in which he has constructively challenged and worked with us on behalf of his constituents. I know this report has been great personal significance for his constituents, and I pay tribute to his dedicated work as an advocate in calling for truth, justice and change for the Grenfell community. And I agree that robust oversight of government's implementation of the response is essential for this, and all public inquiries. The system needs to be improved, and we are taking forward inquiries recommendations on oversight. We will create a publicly accessible record on Gov.uk of recommendations made by public inquiries since 2024, and we will consider making this a legal requirement as part of a wider review of the inquiries framework. For the Grenfell inquiry recommendations, my department will publish quarterly progress updates on gov.uk until they have all been delivered, and we will report annually to Parliament to enable members to scrutinise our progress and hold us to account. In terms of my honourable friend's comments in regard to the Council failed in some of its most fundamental duties, Madam Deputy Speaker, to keep residents safe, to listen to their concerns and respond effectively when disaster struck. They were right to apologise, but it's clear more must be done. I've welcomed the Council's commitment to improvement and culture change, and I've set my challenge to the leader of the Council to ensure that these improvements are a reality felt by the Council's residents, and I will continue to engage and keep an eye on that progress.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today, and indeed all of our thoughts are, of course, are with the victims and the families of the victims. And I know she will keep us up to date with what is going to happen in terms of a permanent memorial. The key issue here, the big failure that she hasn't spoken about, was of course the testing regime for the products that were put on Grenfell and buildings up and down this country. And the signing off of those testing regimes where firms deliberately cheated on the system, and indeed they were still signed off as being safe. So will she undertake to ensure that the safety mechanisms and testing of products in systems is actually undertaken so that we can ensure that the buildings for the future and the buildings we've got already will be made safe and safe for the residents that live in them?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and I absolutely agree with what he says. The government is committed to a system-wide reform of the construction products regime, ensuring that we address the significant gaps that the Grenfell inquiry and the independent review of construction product testing have exposed. The construction products green paper that we have published today is a significant step forward towards a construction products regime that has public safety at its heart, and I hope we can continue to work cross-government and cross this House to make sure that we have a system that is fit for purpose for the future.
Andy Slaughter.
Madam Deputy Speaker, would the Secretary of State go a little further than she did to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington and Bayswater? It's good that she's going to have a publicly accessible record of recommendations. Will she commit to what the charity inquest and many others have asked for, which is a national oversight mechanism, i.e. a body which collates, analyses and follows up on the recommendations of inquiries and inquests, because otherwise there is a real danger that these recommendations and others will gather dust on the shelf.
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I heard directly from members of the Grenfell community their call for the government to introduce a national oversight mechanism. We recognise this goes wider than Grenfell, and it is an important issue for other communities and families as well, that such as those that were affected by COVID-19 and the blood scandal. We're considering this in the year ahead as part of the measures to strengthen public inquiries, and the government will listen to the views of the affected families as part of this consideration.
Julie Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the Grenfell tragedy was an appalling one, but it also threw a blanket of uncertainty over countless residents in many of our constituencies who were trapped in cladded properties. So when I hear the Deputy Prime Minister talk about a new regulatory regime and change, I confess I feel very nervous that any changes to the regulatory regime will throw further uncertainty over those who are still trapped in their homes. So can she provide assurances to the House that any move she makes will not create further uncertainty about the standards to which buildings need to be remediated? And then can I also highlight to her the case of my constituents in Harrow Wood who had their buildings assessed by a fire risk assessor who was subsequently struck off. Those people that thought they were going to be released from this terrible stasis are now back to not knowing where they stand. So can she please also look into these concerns?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope that what we're announcing today and what we're trying to do is around bringing clarity to the system. I think one of the things that came out of the Phase 2 report was where the system was disjointed, and actually bringing clarity will hopefully make sure that people understand what they are meant to do, what their legal obligations are, that we expect them to do it, and if they don't do it, there will be serious consequences for those that don't. I also point to the remediation acceleration plan. I completely understand that many people still are in buildings that are unsafe, and that is unacceptable, and that's why this government is taking action on that. And in terms of the Hollinrake case that she mentioned, I'm happy for her to meet with the Building Safety Minister.
Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the Secretary of State for her important statement today. The people of Grenfell were treated badly because of who they were and what they looked like and how much they earned. We say 72 people were killed in Grenfell. The police are holding ashes to which they have no name. And nobody should have to go through this. The family should never have to go through this. This should never happen again. So will the Secretary of State agree with me that, as well as the CEOs of the companies, all of the people in the council who treated the residents badly and did not listen to them because of what they looked like, everybody needs to be held accountable?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. And at the heart of the new regulatory regime is the requirement that all landlords treat their tenants with fairness and respect and take action as that the services they provide are fair and equitable outcomes. Social landlords are required to understand and provide information and support that recognises the diverse needs of their tenants, including those arising from protected characteristics. This hasn't been so in the past, Madam Deputy Speaker, and if I'm honest, it doesn't feel when I speak to the residents of the community that it is that today, and that's why I've pushed the council in that particular area, and that's why this government is bringing forward legislation that says we respect people, whether they're social tenants or whether they're private tenants. They deserve a safe and secure home and be treated with dignity and respect.
Tim Farron.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement and indeed the moves generally towards centralised regulation and improved safety. Doesn't the report just serve as a single act of shame for this country? As she has just alluded to, it reveals that it has been considered that the safety and the quality of social housing matters less, because the people who live in social housing matter less. Shouldn't there be a matter of deep national repentance of that point of view, which has been the case really since the decline in standards of building since the 1960s? So as she seeks to tackle this, has she spoken to, and is she continue to speak to, her right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer? Because there is a cost involved in making sure that we build to a high standard, as we did in the immediate post-war period, whilst also expanding the number of social rented homes, particularly in parts of the country where build costs are more expensive, like London and like the Lake District.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for the way in which he articulates something that I am still dismayed to this day that archaic attitudes toward people in social tenancy is considered in that way. I was a social tenant for a very long time and grew up in a council house, and the way in which these people were treated, especially after this report, I ask anyone who works in social housing, Madam Deputy Speaker, to read the report, at least read the executive findings if they don't want to go through the chapters that I went through. The horrifying way that people were treated that Sir Martin outlines in his report, and that is a shame for our country, and we must do better, and hopefully the legislation we're bringing forward will bring about a cultural change. And I absolutely agree with him that social housing should be of high quality and safe. It should be affordable, it should be warm, and that's why this government will continue to do that. Safety will not be compromised in building 1.5 million homes, and nor will the 1.5 million homes compromise us on bringing homes that are currently not at standard up to standard, because we've all seen the reports, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've all seen on the television the programmes where people are still living in damp and mouldy properties. That has to end.
Ben Coleman.
Speaker, I also very much welcome the statement by the Deputy Prime Minister. The people who lived in Grenfell Tower and the people in my constituency in Chelsea and Fulham who stands shoulder to shoulder with them. The people have suffered hugely and the pain is still felt throughout the whole community. And I'm delighted to hear my honourable friend, the member for Kensington Bayswater, highlighting again the culpability of the local council and of the contractors, and there is much for the council to do, I know from my own experience, to improve the way that it respects and deals with people living in social housing. I'd also like, if I may, to pick up on the point made very powerfully by my honourable friend from Vauxhall and Camberwell about disabled people, 15 of whom died in the Grenfell Tower because they had no personal emergency evacuation plan. And I welcome, as my honourable friend did, I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's commitment to introduce regulation to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable people. But may I ask her, when will we see the details? Will this apply to all disabled residents wherever they live? What legal weight are these regulations going to have so that we can be absolutely sure that all is being done to ensure that we do not get a situation where disabled people do not have the evacuation plans they need to escape in the event of a terrible fire such as Grenfell?
I thank my honourable friend for those comments, and he's absolutely right. And since taking office, we have ensured that all of the outstanding Phase 1 recommendations were fully considered and responded to. The government announced on the 2nd of September 2024 that a residential peaks policy would be taken forward. We also committed funding for it, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the government will lay regulations as soon as possible with social housing providers funding made available this year. This policy aims to improve the fire safety and evacuation of disabled, vulnerable residents in high-rise and higher-rise residential buildings in England by providing residents with disability and impairments with a person-centred risk assessment to identify appropriate equipment and adjustments, to aid their fire safety evacuation, a residential PEEP statement that records what vulnerable residents should do in the event of a fire, and information for fire and rescue services in case they need to undertake evacuation, and will continue to keep this under review.
Sir Julian Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I refer the House to my declaration of voluntary interests. Can I commend the Deputy Prime Minister for the sensitivity that she is and the way she's approaching this, both with families and in the House today. As she knows, mediation efforts being led by Lord Neuberger and others with residents of Grenfell, I genuinely believe mediation in this situation is of massive value. I realise much of this is in the legal sphere, but would she commit in any way she can and the government can to supporting these mediation efforts?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I think it's absolutely right that we look at all options, and I'm happy for him to take that up with our Safety Minister as well. But we want to continue to support the community. The community have been through so much. I visited that site, Madam Deputy Speaker. I saw the head teachers of the school where children who were not even born when the tragedy happened are still having the effects of the trauma today. So we're committed to supporting the community, the bereaved and the survivors as long as it takes.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I also thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her response to the report on Grenfell and the tragedy. Madam Deputy Speaker, flats in a large leasehold block in my constituency were given a B2 EWS1 certificate by Adam Kisiak of Trifire Limited. He and Trifire have now been investigated for potential malpractice by the Institute of Fire Engineers. One of my constituents, a leaseholder in the block, told me that they don't know if their certificates are valid. They don't know whether they'll be able to be remediated through the Building Safety Fund, and they don't even know whether their block actually does still have a safety issue, quite apart from the fact that those needing to move can't sell because mortgage lenders won't lend. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, how and when can leaseholders like my constituents get the assurance they need and that there will be no more fire inspectors being allowed to get away with what Adam Kisiak did?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that very important question, and I'm sorry for the situation that her constituents found themselves in. I understand the relevant professional body is investigating the case that is mentioned, and it would be wrong of me to comment on the specifics, but we are working to encourage mortgage lenders to act proportionately to support leaseholders and buyers in buildings with EWS ones that mortgage lenders are not accepting, and where buildings in a remediation scheme or the leaseholder is protected by the Building Safety Act, we expect the 10 lenders who have signed the industry cladding statement to honour it and not require the EWS1. And and if the member wants to speak to the Safety Minister on this particular case going forward, I'm sure he'd be happy to speak to her.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement today, and particularly welcome the Government's acceptance of the recommendation to professionalise and regulate fire engineers and assessors, not least because at the committee stage of the Fire Safety Bill, I tabled new Clause 2, which would have created a public register of fire risk assessors, and it would have done so 5 years ago. Had my amendment been accepted, we may have been able to avoid what is now the developing scandal of the issuance of potentially fraudulent EWS1 certificates by Trifire, which could now have a devastating impact on thousands of leaseholders, including some in my constituency of St Albans. In light of concerns both in the media and concerns that have been raised in this House today by members of all sides, could I please urge the Deputy Prime Minister to both convene a meeting for all MPs whose constituents are affected, and would she agree with me that it is now time that the police investigate these reports?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will expand that invitation. I'm sure the Safety Minister will be happy to do that. And we will legislate to make it a mandatory requirement for fire risk assessors that are competent to perform their critical roles, certified against approved standards by a UKS accredited certification body. And the Government is supporting an industry-led British standard for fire risk assessors that's currently being drafted. And once this is completed, this will create a single clear definition of competence against which certification and qualification should be mapped.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our thoughts today are obviously with the Grenfell survivors and the family and friends of those who died. Can I thank my right honourable friend for a comprehensive response to the inquiry report. I think I agree with everything she said, but I want one point of clarification and one of pushing her to go a little bit further, if I could. First of all, on clarification, she's rightly said it's really important that we respect and value social housing tenants and treat them equally. Is she therefore going to give equal access to social housing tenants to the Building Safety Fund that is currently enjoyed by private leaseholders? And secondly, in terms of product testing, the testing of products by the construction manufacturers has been a disgrace over many years. They've gone round from one testing house to another till they've found one that actually passes the products. They could have several failures and one pass, but those products are on the market. Will she pick up a recommendation from the Select Committee in the last Parliament, cross-party, which said that every test done on a construction product should be made public, whether it's a failure or a pass? And then we can all see absolutely the real strength of these products and whether they really are fit for purpose before they're put on buildings.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and I'm certainly happy to look at that. We accepted all of the recommendations in full regarding what the Phase 3 report came out with, and I think it's an important baseline, but happy to look at what more we can do. And in terms of social housing as well, at the autumn budget we'll set out plans to give councils and housing associations the rent stability they need to be able to borrow and invest in both new and existing homes, while also ensuring that there's appropriate protections for both existing and future housing tenants. We'll bring forward details for future government investment as part of the forthcoming spending review, and we'll keep that under review.
So Julian Lewis.
Leaseholders listening to the Deputy Prime Minister's very comprehensive statement today will have heard her mention the role of developers in remediation for those blocks covered in inadequate and dangerous cladding. Can she explain in more detail what happens where those developers may have defaulted in some way, may no longer be in existence, and freeholders then seek to visit the costs of remediation on the innocent leaseholders? I think the legislation covers this to some extent, but it would be helpful if she would set it out in more detail.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and they will get access to the cladding remediation scheme. And we're really clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that building owners must fix their buildings, and there's no doubt about that. And there are already legal powers to enforce landlords to act, and we'll make them do that quicker and give them a harder bite as part of that. But we also recognise that there is some elements where that won't happen, and that's why that scheme is available.
Oh, Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is right to say that progress has been made on building safety, but that we need to go much further. She'll know that fire and rescue services have already made huge improvements in this area, both with new equipment and also processes, but we must roll out stronger national standards across the fire and rescue sector. So can I ask her what progress has been made on establishing the National College of Fire and Rescue?
I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and he's absolutely right, and the Phase 2 report by Sir Martin was very clear on the recommendations, and we are taking them forward. We intend to launch a consultation on the College of Fire and Rescue, including proposed functions and structures this summer. Delivering a college will require careful planning and investment, as well as legislation to ensure that it would have the necessary legal foundations, and we're also considering funding models as part of the spending review.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome everything that the Deputy Prime Minister has said, and other honourable members too. But there is still a fatal flaw which has not been raised, and as someone with 30 years' experience in the real estate sector, can I urge the Deputy Prime Minister and her officials to focus on the single staircase? Because the 2009 Lacanau House report recommended that above 6 storeys, retrospectively, fire suppression systems, sprinkler systems were installed. It's the best way to save lives. And I think we need to relook at that for existing buildings, and also future buildings can still be designed with a single staircase above 6 storeys until 2028. That, Deputy Prime Minister, I would urge you to say is too long.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his contribution to this debate and also his expertise in this area. The approved document B is now subject to continuous review by the building safety regulator, who has already taken steps in regards to this matter, and a wider review of building safety regulations will be undertaken, and we'll consider what action is needed from all resulting recommendations.
Mike Reader.
Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State and her team for their work on the government's response to the inquiry. I would just say to the House, as someone who's spent my life in the construction sector, fixing construction products is incredibly challenging, so I really welcome the Green Paper published today, because we have to get that right. 2 questions to the Secretary of State. Could you confirm that the new regulator and advisor will work with existing government and industry bodies, including the Construction Leadership Council, which is co-chaired by the Minister of Industry and Mark Malton and Mace, who've done some brilliant work on building safety already? And could you also set out a bit more clearly the teeth that the new regulator is going to have to tackle dodgy developers and cowboy builders, big and small?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and yes, they will work together, and hopefully that's what we want to see. And the building safety regulator, we've granted funding and also support for them and the safety executive to improve the support that's offered, and will continue to do so. They will have teeth. We will be looking at what further legislation we may need, Madam Deputy Speaker, but we expect where there is issues and where things have been highlighted that action is taken, and where action isn't taken, we expect there to be consequences.
Paula Denyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her commitment to the inquiry's recommendations and her commitment to systemic change. Picking up the thread from the 2 honourable members opposite around an oversight mechanism for state-related deaths, I was shocked when I discovered that it is nobody's job to track and make sure that recommendations from Prevention of Future Death reports are enacted. These have a relevance for victims of huge tragedies like this one, but just as much for individual tragedies such as that of one of my constituents. And so I have a private member's bell in on this proposal. So I would like to ask the Deputy Prime Minister to meet with me to talk about this idea in detail and how it can be enacted.
Well, again, I think the honourable member is absolutely right to raise this regarding oversight mechanism, and I think I've addressed some of that and the wider issues that, not just in terms of this inquiry, but all inquiries that we've had, and there's been far too many inquiries into tragedies in that we shouldn't be having these scandals and these tragedies happen in the first place. But we are committed to looking at what oversight mechanisms. I've detailed the oversight mechanisms that I expect from my department and the recommendations from Grenfell, and I'm happy for her to bring that information, share that with my department, and I'll take considerations into account.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My thoughts today are with the survivors of the Grenfell Tower disaster and the 72 families who are mourning the loss of a loved one still, and I pay tribute to their immense dignity as they continue to fight for justice. I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's clear commitment to implement all of Sir Martin Morbick's recommendations. I have constituents in Dulwich and West Norwood living in blocks with fire safety issues, often not cladding related, but issues that have been identified as part of the wider scandal in the construction industry that was uncovered by fire safety inspections post-Grenfell. That in some cases there have been fires in these blocks, terrifying fires, leaving residents feeling unsafe and leaving leaseholders trapped in unsellable flats as building owners and construction firms argue over who is responsible for the fire safety defects and fail to move forward to resolve the issues. So can the Deputy Prime Minister say, as she moves forward to implement Sir Martin's recommendations, when she would expect my constituents to have a clear plan with a timescale attached to it for the remediation work that is needed in unsafe buildings, and where is the accountability in the meantime?
Again, I thank my honourable friend for her comments, and I absolutely agree that, you know, nearly 8 years on from the tragedy of Grenfell, people are still living in unsafe buildings, and that's completely unacceptable. I did respect and pay tribute to the previous governments, what they've done, and those legislation has enabled authorities to take action, and we've been supporting them in making sure that action is taken from those bodies, and our remediation acceleration plan will also outline how we can ensure that those responsible for remediating buildings, whether that's fire safety or any other defects, are held accountable, and that we can take those actions and get that remediation done as quickly as possible. I do not want it to take another 8 years before people are living in safe and secure homes. I expect to do it as quickly as possible, and action is already being taken.
Dr Al Pinkerton.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. And can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for what she said today and how she said it. I hope that the families of the survivors of Grenfell Tower have heard what you have to say and find some reassurance in the acceptance of all of the recommendations. I have residents in my constituency of Surrey Heath who are today trapped in just the latest chapter of the fire safety scandal. Residents who have EWS1 forms similarly signed off by the notorious now fire safety engineer Adam Kiziak, who find themselves unable to sell their properties, unable to remortgage, but even more fundamentally, who don't know whether they are living in a dangerous building or not, and in neighbouring buildings built at exactly the same time, but signed off or have had their EWS1 forms produced by a different fire safety engineer. They have already been stripped of their cladding. I'm incredibly grateful to hear that you have accepted recommendations 15 and 16 and that you are looking at a professionalisation of the fire safety industry, greater regulation and a commitment to greater recruitment, because we know that those are some of the issues that have underpinned the EWS1 scandal. But can I urge you and your team, please, to think about emergency measures. And it can't just be right that we overlook the EWS1 forms that people already have because people don't know whether they are living in safe buildings or not. It cannot be right that we just overlook those forms. We have to fundamentally, rapidly reassess the safety of those buildings in order to allow them to be sellable or remediated again. Thank you.
Well, again, I refer back to what I said to my honourable friend, and I absolutely accept that people should be in safe and secure homes. The government remediation funds have a robust audit process in place to assess the quality of the fire risk assessments of external wards, and the audit process ensures that assessments that are carried out for buildings that are in our remediation funding programmes meet the appropriate standards, and where these standards are not met, we will take action to ensure that this is addressed.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The report on the Grenfell Tower inquiry is utterly scathing about the role of central government and its obsession with deregulation. The drive to scrap the so-called red tape was a key failing which led to such a terrible incident and avoidable loss of life. So can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm to the House that this approach has been ditched in relation to policies which are concerning fire safety, building safety and the construction sector?
Again, my honourable friend's absolutely right to highlight that just about every system failed, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I outlined in my opening statement. Everybody needs to understand what led to what happened on that night in Grenfell, and that there has been action taken. There isn't the same regulatory system that was in place back in 2017. There has been a number of Acts of Parliament that has meant that there is more instruction and more legal requirements for building safety. We will continue to update that. We have legislation going through at the moment in Parliament which hopefully will deal with social landlords and will give renters more protection as well. We know there's much more for us to do, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope across the House we'll continue to work to put safety at the heart of everything we do, because that will be the legacy of Grenfell, is that we take notice. We don't just say one word at this dispatch box, but we actually take the action that's needed to protect people.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for bringing the report forward, and also thank the Government for accepting all of the recommendations, and also echo the points from around the Chamber that our thoughts today are with the survivors and the families of the victims. As is often said, justice delayed is justice denied. So can the Deputy Prime Minister please give a timeline for when the companies, as mentioned, Arconic, Kingspan, Saint-Gobain or Celotex, but also the testing firms who covered up these failed results, when will they face justice for their dishonesty and mis-selling that so tragically contributed to the deaths of 72 innocent residents?
Again, I echo what the Honourable Gentleman said in terms of where our thoughts and sentiments are today as we all are in this chamber. I spoke about the justice and justice being delayed, and I think it's awful that people still haven't got the justice and fearful that they'll never receive the justice. The police have said that this will take time. This is one of the largest and most legally complex investigations ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police, with over 180 officers and staff dedicated to the investigation, and we will continue to support them in their important work. The police have recently confirmed that they have everything they need to do that, and will continue to support their efforts. And I said in my opening statement around procurement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and making sure that we can do something in regards to construction products, and my honourable friend sat on the front bench is taking that forward.
John Grady.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my constituency, tenants in social housing are regularly treated as second-class citizens. And it is a shame and a stain on our society that this is so. And in my constituency, many people are desperately worried about cladding remediation following the terror of Grenfell. The Scottish Government received about £97 million from the Government for cladding remediation, confirmed later on last year, but virtually none of this had been spent on cladding remediation. And I wrote to the Scottish Minister responsible this year with a detailed set of questions about progress about cladding remediation. How many high-rise buildings, that's over 80, with ACM cladding had been identified? How many of them had been identified as requiring remediation? How many of such high-rise buildings had been remediated? These are people's homes, Madam Deputy Speaker. And my questions carried on. And not one of those questions were answered with data or numbers. These are people's homes. They are mums and dads, children. Would the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that the Scottish Government must get a grip on this topic, and would she undertake to me that she would provide such advice and assistance in that regard as her department could provide? I'm obliged, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you to my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right that it is a devolved matter, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the Scottish Government, but I'm happy to work with the Scottish Government. I hope they've looked at what we're doing in regards to the remediation acceleration plan and also the reforms that are underway which will drive up standards in social housing through stronger regulation and enforcement measures by strengthening tenants' voice and improving tenants' access to redress. He's absolutely right to raise these issues. I hope the Scottish Government are following in our footsteps and will continue to learn the legacy of what happened in Grenfell so that people in Scotland and England can feel safe.
Sean Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Deputy Prime Minister particularly for the comments she made about the way that residents were treated. I want to raise the strong recommendation that the Civil Contingencies Act is looked at, because my former role involved listening to and trying to support the many local community organisations who were dealing with the enormous gaps in the humanitarian response that was left by the local authority, and these problems carried on for weeks. So could the Deputy Prime Minister tell us when we will hear the timing and the format of that review of the Civil Contingencies Act?
Well, again, we looked at the Civil Contingency Act and also the Category 1 training, and we've said that we accept and we will take them forward. We want to do it as quickly as possible, and we'll be working with local partners to scope progress for local authorities on training and working with all other departments to make sure we can do that as quickly as possible. And I also commend her for her comments in regard to social housing tenants. I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, listening to members from all across this House today that represent their constituents, that those outside of the House are listening.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement today and her continued commitment to get justice for the victims of this terrible tragedy. I had the opportunity to meet some of the families of those victims, and I want to commend their bravery. I will also, of course, take this opportunity to pay tribute to my constituent, Rod Wainwright, who was one of the first responders on that terrible morning. Does the Secretary of State agree with me we need to do more to support our emergency services like Rod and his colleagues who were also the victims of this terrible tragedy? And let me join with my honourable friend from Bent East from praying and hoping that we never have to see something like this again.
Secretary of State.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I pay tribute to Rob and his colleagues. And of course, not long after being appointed into this position as Secretary of State, of course, there's another fire within Barking and Dagenham, and it was the same first responders that were out again, and the trauma and the fact that they put themselves at arm's way without question or fear is an absolute testament for the work that they do, and we owe them a debt of gratitude, and we also owe them the support ongoing when they have done that, and we continue as a government to do that.
Final question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank very much the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement today and for the update in relation to Phase 2 of the inquiry report. I think we all in this House would be encouraged by the Honourable Lady's commitment to find two things to find. Make sure that those who carry it out are held responsible under the law of the land. Number two, to ensure that safety is improved, and that's what I would like to see. In December past, the government started plans to ban firms involved in the Grenfell fire from the public procurement. Whilst this is a very welcome step, Madam Deputy Speaker, what steps can be taken or will be taken to ensure that all firms involved in building works are liable to ensure that all materials and products are fit for purpose, to ensure that lessons can be learnt for the future from this awful tragedy? And will the Deputy Prime Minister share the conclusions with all regional administrations, especially the Northern Ireland Assembly, so that safety across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be improved and that we all gain? Thank you so much.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his comments, and my honourable friend, the Minister, met in Northern Ireland yesterday, so I absolutely agree with him that we should all work together to improve safety, and also that we need to make sure that the building safety regulator and what we put in train actually produces the results that we need. Hopefully, Madam Deputy Speaker, this will be a clearer path. It will be clear about what people's legal obligations are, where they sit, and if they don't do what they are expected to do, that they will be absolute enforcement of those rules.
That concludes that statement. I'll give the ministers and the front bench some time just to readjust.